Hello and welcome to my cabin here in Iceland. I thought I would talk today about all of the masks that I've made in chronological order, from the very first one right up until the most recent. Maybe it's helpful to say a few words about them before I jump in. That part of my work, mask making, happened quite accidentally and organically. They all sprung out of the long collaboration I've had with Björk for the last 11, almost 12 years now. Through lots of sharing of ideas and references and videos and books, I would often then take all those away into my little studio and try and make something for her to wear that I felt might fit with the emotional or aesthetic requirements of whatever we're working on, whether it was a music video or a photo shoot or a concert. The first one I made was almost 6 years ago to the day, so I'm going to start with that one and see how it all goes. I called this one the family mask because it was used on the video shoot for the song Family, which also ended up as one of the album covers of the album. And this mask was actually made as a birthday present. We were shooting on Björk's birthday here in Iceland, and I can't remember my reason why, but I made this odd looking embroidered stingray thing that goes over the face, and the embroidery would frame the features using this oval shape that became one of the visual themes of the whole era. And also it's latex, so I was embroidering wool, a neon wool, into latex, which is quite interesting. I hadn't done that before. Yeah, and this is interesting for me also looking back now, because not only was it the first mask, but it was the first time that I saw something I'd made physically being translated into the digital world, because Andrew Huang, who directed this, he added afterwards CGI threads and pearls on the piece in the video, and this is a kind of dialogue that's happened throughout the whole mask making thing for me, between something that I've embroidered or bent or made physically with my hands, and then seeing it being translated into the digital world for a virtual reality video or for a music video or for a filter. So yeah, it's surprising to me that relationship between the digital and the physical was happening already with the first mask. The second one I made was about 6 months later. This is now June 2015, and we were preparing for the first live performance of Vulnakura, and Björk had been sharing with me lots of images of moths with these crazy antennae. So I made this moth mask, I call it, onto lace, and this had a lot of features on it that would crop up in later masks, like lots of pearls I added and neon thread. It went on to appear on the live album cover, and also a paper fold-out mask that people can make at home on a deluxe vinyl, I think it was. The next few masks were made in quite quick succession while we were touring Vulnakura around Europe. So most of them were made at 4 a.m. in a hotel room the night before the concert, which is a little stressful because hand embroidery is not the quickest medium. Yeah, the next one was, I remember making that in Slovakia, in a hotel room there. That was the white lace mask. Then I made the vocal cord headpiece, we call it. This was an idea of Björk's to have lines emanating out from her vocal cords. So I embroidered 2 vocal cords that sat on the throat, and then experimented with pleating this kind of gauzy fabric, which was actually quite hard to embroider, but this shape actually became a favourite of Björk's just to wear in her kind of everyday life. So this has been made in lots of different colours subsequently, in like peach and turquoise and white, which I think was worn at Fuji Rock Festival once. The next mask was I remember making that in Berlin. the idea was moving the focus from the face onto the ears. So I made these embroidered sound waves circling the ears. And this was playing also with an idea to have two layers to the embroidery, that in normal white light, the embroidery appears one character, and then when it's put under UV light, all the neon thread that's kind of hidden in daylight suddenly pops out. So there's two characters to one mask, and we started doing that with a lot of these masks, that we'd choose some songs in the set list that only had UV lights, so the mask could also transform during the concert. The next mask I made was, I call it Þjóðbúningar, which is the name for the traditional Icelandic costume, which is embroidered on black velvet. This mask was mostly important for me because it was when I started wanting to loop the thread around the face, and I actually fixed a lot of the embroidery into the teeth because I was aiming for some sort of metamorphosis, like the embroidery was coming out of the body itself. And that was an idea which I developed more in the next mask, which was for a music video called Not Get. And this was the first time I decided to use wire instead of thread. So a lot of my later masks have been more, I guess, like jewelry or metalwork. But in my head, they're all stemmed back to embroidery, because what I was always trying to do was just to manipulate the thread in 3 dimensions around the head. So I still call myself an embroiderer, even though I am embroidering about 10% of the time when I'm making these masks. This video needed 2 quite distinct characters for each half. The first half needed to be quite dark and goth, and I made this kind of metal moth from wire and pearls. This was also the first time I put pearls in front of the eyes, which is something I've done millions of times on the other masks. And for the second half, I made the piece that I call Medusa, which is a hand-cut plastic neon kind of jellyfish type shape around the head. A lot of my later masks fall into some kind of subgroups or families, and this is the first of the jellyfish type shape that I made for this video. Again, both of these masks ended up being transformed into the 3D world, both in a VR video but also in the music video. There was some brilliant CG added by Nick and Warren, the directors, and the Medusa mask was also the first filter that we made, so I like that mask. The next one I made was in Sydney while we were launching Bjork Digital, and it included some little reflective panels in it that were put there to give a burst of protective light when a flash photograph was taken. That's something I included on some later masks too. The next mask was made in Tokyo in a bathroom in an Airbnb, which I remember very clearly. This was also for Bjork Digital DJ interview that we were there for, and this was made just by bending one continuous piece of wire that I'd picked up in a shop in Tokyo, bending it symmetrically and enclosing little pearls as I went along. But it meant that it was quite light and easy to wear, and this was also converted into a digital mask by Andy Huang for the family VR video. But it not only did it go on the head, but it covered the whole body. So that was another one that I saw treated digitally after I'd made it. The next 2 I made them in London, and they were for a performance at the Royal Albert Hall. The first one was a continuation of the bent symmetrical wire thing that I'd done in Tokyo, but it was in silver with lots of pearls. It was very, very fragile and light, that piece. And the other one I made was this ghost orchid headpiece, which is possibly one of my favourite pieces that I've made. It took a very long time because it's all hand stitched in place, which was quite difficult because the thread was always getting caught on the spikes. But the idea was to have this focus on the eye with these with these lines and pearls emanating out, and the shape is based on a real orchid called the ghost orchid. And this was probably the culmination of that idea of the UV light giving the mask two different characters, because in normal white light this one appears quite soft and milky and orchidy, but if it goes anywhere near a UV light, the thread really picks it up and it transforms into this electric underwater kind of character. At the time, I think we were starting to move out of the Vulnicura colour scheme era, the neon and the lilac, and so I put this red gradient seeping in from the back of the mask as a little nod to the fact that the neon Vulnicura era was disappearing off the end of the mask, and this new red burgundy colour was creeping in, which the next mask had. This I made very quickly. I remember making it literally as Björk was walking on stage. I was still finishing it, and it was made in a similar way as the Ghost Orchid. It was a hand-cut plastic stitched onto wire with lots of pearls and paint added. The next piece I made after that was in Montreal, and it was again for the opening of a Björk digital exhibition, and this is almost like the skeleton of the Medusa piece. That's how I saw it. It has the same silhouette and the same pearl head cap underneath, but more like a pearl skeleton structure. And actually the beads I used on that were again really reflective under a flashlight, so kind of giving the mask a protective element to it also. Then I made a new version of the vocal cord headpiece, which was worn in a concert, I think only once, but it was like a sister to that piece, and also a little nod to an Elizabethan ruff almost. The next piece was made for a TV interview here in Iceland, so it was deliberately not as theatrical as the previous headpieces, a bit more like a piece of jewellery, and it had the jellyfish shape on top but the orchid shape on the bottom. We're now in December 2016, and I made a updated version of the Medusa headpiece, but this time in red, and I was also inspired a lot for this one by, I'd been watching videos of corals spawning, and I guess mushrooms also, so I covered it in these little pearls, and also had adapted the design slightly so it was open in the eyes so Björk could see what she was doing while she was DJing a bit better. The Uggler Mask I made for a video conference that we made with Mexico for the opening of Björk Digital, and this involved a lot of beadwork. The fabric already had all the crystals on it, and I cut it all up and made this shape, and then added hundreds and hundreds of pearls and long glass beads around the eyes, and it's called Uggler because that's the word for owl in Icelandic. So I had all this beadwork around each eye, and I also added lots of wires with pearls on it coming off the top. So then in January the next year, in 2017, I made this piece, which was the first mask I'd made for myself, and it was for a photo shoot with Tim Walker for ID magazine. I wanted to make my own version of the Green Man, which is a English folk pagan character, almost like a fertility god. He's represented in a lot of church carvings, and I was always obsessed with that character as a kid, so I was wanting to do my own version of it, and I wanted it to look quite painful. I wanted it to look like an oak tree was bursting out of my head and growing quite painfully out of my nose and eyes and ears and mouth. That was the first time I worked with Tim, which I would go on to do a few times after that, so that's a important mask to me. So then we started moving out of the Vulnicura album era and into the Utopia one, and I wanted to make something totally different for the start of that album. We'd gone quite far with all the Vulnicura masks, and they were all quite romantic and embroidered and almost Victorian in a weird way. So I wanted to do something totally different and not repeat myself. And a lot of the references coming from Björk at the time seemed to fit the idea I had of sculpting these silicone face pieces that would be applied to the face and give an almost kind of sci-fi alien feeling to them, but still quite romantic. And believe it or not, I was not actually meaning for these to end up looking so sexual. I was thinking about orchids and flowers while I was sculpting them, but I think a lot of my work subconsciously ends up looking like the reproductive organs, which I don't really know why, but that's what came out. And yeah, we were in LA and we were getting ready to shoot the Gate music video with Andrew Huang, and I locked myself away for about a week and tried to learn how to sculpt and cast silicone in the bathroom at the hotel. And for that video I also made this piece, which was also the first time I'd worked with this new material, this kind of white bony texture, and a lot of references fed into that one. We did a lot of research preparing for that music video in particular, which I'm sure we will release or show at some point, but we did lots of storyboarding and shared a lot of ideas between Andrew Huang and Alessandro Michele and Björk and myself about how that video should look and how the wound from Vulnicura would transform into a portal instead. And yeah, this was the first time I made a mask using this particular material, which I ended up making more later. Then I made a update of the vocal cord headpiece that was never actually worn on stage, but I think it was worn backstage once. And this was embroidered onto clear plastic so that the pearls would be resting on the cheeks, almost like tears. Then I went back to sculpting silicone for a photo shoot that we did with Jessie Kander for Dazed and Confused. And this was in Paris, I remember. And the inspiration for this piece was lichen and mosses and fungus. And I sculpted these two symmetrical large pieces that laid down either side of the face, so it looked like lichen was growing on the face. And these were cast again in lots of different colours, and I think we ended up using them on the Utopia music video as set dressing to look like actual lichen on the rocks. The next piece I made was this mouth orchid, which was taking the silicone work that I'd done around the eyes and forehead and trying to transform the mouth into an orchid itself so that you could open and close, and the tongue and the inside of the mouth would be like the inner part of a flower. This was shot by Tim Walker again and ended up on the cover of W magazine and Time Out, I think. The green orchid and pearl piece was made for Björk to wear in a online live discussion with Dazed and Confused, and this piece is probably most interesting to me because it highlights something that's important about all of my masks, which is that I don't like them to be instantly readable of how they fix onto the head. I'm always trying to avoid a very obvious headband or loop over the ear or elastic around the back. I often, when I'm designing them, I'm trying to figure out a balance between something that is functional and can be worn, but something that has the illusion of floating or growing out of the face. So this piece is held mostly in place just by two hair clips here, holding it in place, and the tension of the wire holds the rest of it against the face. A little after that piece, I made the braid jewellery for the Blissing Me music video, and this was an idea that Björk had of making some kind of jewellery to go in the braids, which was also really functional because it meant you could shape the braid exactly how you wanted it and it would stay in place. I also made lots of these for the next project, which was the Utopia music video. I ended up making these braid jewellery pieces for all of the flute players, but I ended up sculpting lots of new silicone pieces for that, some to go around the side of the eyes and some on the forehead, and they were often inspired by orchid roots and orchid shapes. So that was the start of the next couple of years where I was making pieces not only for Björk but also for the musicians that she was working with, which would become quite an interesting part of the mask making process. So later that year we made the Arise in My Senses music video directed by Jesse Kander, and amongst all the references that Björk shared for that project were some videos of slugs mating, which had this amazing wet, luminous, translucent kind of texture. So that's what I was going for with this mask. And this mask was, I guess, a kind of cousin of the ghost orchid. But whereas the ghost orchid had all the focus was leading into the eyes, this I wanted to make the mouth the focus, because the lyric of the song is all about a kiss, and all focus is here. So I made the lower petals much more dominant, and they would kind of frame and draw focus into the mouth. Just before Christmas that year, we had another Björk Digital DJ performance, so I made this iridescent plastic version of the Medusa Jellyfish headpieces, and I think that was also worn during a concert in Georgia. Then the next year we started preparing to take Utopia on tour, and I started work on all these different bone orchid pieces, I call them. The idea of these was that they would be a sort of exoskeleton orchid bone sound wave piece that would go on the head. It was important for me that each of the flute players got their own design and shape. I didn't want to just replicate the same thing over and over and have it turn into a sort of uniform. It could have gone into stormtrooper territory, and each of the flute players had such a strong and distinct character. I wanted to represent that. So I spent a long time working on these, because logistically they had to be able to play the flute in them and be able to walk around the stage and do choreography and see where they were going. So there were quite a few constraints, but that can also be fun sometimes. During that Utopia album era, there was also a live TV performance for Jules Holland in the UK, and so I sculpted this new silicone piece for that would be worn again on the forehead and around the eyes, but I also combined it with one of the wire nose jewelry pieces that I've been making in the meantime. Some of those were also photographed by Tim Walker again. These pieces in particular were really about a total transformation, like the face was turning into something else and that things were growing out of the nose. Then we went on tour, and the next couple of pieces I made on the road. I remember making the Björkid piece in a hotel room in Paris, and this was taking a similar shape to the white orchid piece I'd made, but updating it in gold, and it was relatively simple to make this one, but I felt it was one of the most effective on stage from a distance. Then later on, we were in Sweden, I think, on tour, and I made this red jellyfish update, which was a lot more open, so it was easier to see and perform and navigate a festival stage in. Then after the tour, when I got back to Iceland, I shot a video with Gucci and GQ, and for that I made this seaweed headpiece. The idea was almost like I'd drowned and seaweed and pearls had grown around my body and were growing out of my skull. So we shot some of that in the lake next to my cabin, and I also wore for that video a lot of the previous silicone pieces but cast in different colours, and lots of the different nose pieces too. Then we enter the Cornucopia era. So for those shows, when they opened in New York, I again wanted to do something slightly differently. I didn't want to do the white bony pieces again, and I didn't want to do the silicone or the embroidered thing. I wanted pieces that were more like jewellery and with a bit more weight to them than my previous wire pieces. So I started hand cutting all these pieces from brass and polishing them. And again, I wanted all the flute players to have their own individual designs, because I was making some that went under the eyes or went on the side of the head or down the middle of the head. They could often be worn in combination with each other, and Even Bjork wore them in lots of different configurations and combinations. Then after New York, we took Cornucopia to Mexico, which is where I made this orchid head spine. So it was back to the bony white texture, but I wanted it to go over the crown of the head like a spine, but along the spine there were orchid buds growing out of it. And while we're in Mexico, I actually started working on my first filter. We had scheduled a live Instagram Q&A with Dazed and Confused, and I wanted to make Bjork a new mask for it, but I thought since it was on Instagram I could try and do it digitally. So I shut myself away and tried to figure out all the 3D AR filter software and made this Bjorkid filter, which I ended up exhibiting in Utrecht, but in a different color scheme, so you could only try it on if you went to the exhibition in person. Interestingly, the next physical mask I made stemmed out of the filter 3D work. I'd started work on a filter that was inspired by a stingray skeleton down either side of the face, and I'd sculpted it and shaped it all and configured it in my 3D modeling software. And then when we were back on tour and I was starting to make a new mask, I ended up making a physical version of the 3D mask that I'd started work on. I'll often make a design or a shape in the digital world and then replicate it in the real world, but then I'll figure something new out while I'm bending metal, and we'll take that back into the digital world, and then I'll do something new there. And they're always trying to keep up with each other and outdo each other, but they also flow into each other. Then I made a very quick filter also in the stingray skeleton world for Bjork to do an online announcement, and I think I may try and finish that and release it soon. The next piece I made was the one that I'm currently wearing for Gentle Monster redefinition of eyewear project. So this had to be more like a traditional pair of glasses, and it was inspired by vertebrae and by seaweed and some different flowers that I was looking at the time. And it was also turned into a filter after I made it. So now we're up to 2020 and the most recent pieces I made, and those are the two creatures I made for Tilda Swinton to wear at the Venice Film Festival this year. That was a really fun commission because I rarely take commissions, but also because the design requirements of them were the exact opposite of all the previous pieces I've made for Bjork. For those, the mouth was always had to be clear so she could perform and sing and hold a microphone there, and they usually had to be semi-permanently attached onto the head so she could perform and headbang and they wouldn't fall off. But for Tilda, it was the exact opposite. They had to primarily cover the mouth, but they also had to be removable so she could take them on and off on the red carpet and during her speech. So we did some Skypes and spoke about the ideas, and yeah, there's definitely a nod in them to the Venetian masquerade with this handle, and which I turned into the kind of the tail of the creature. But the inspiration for them was definitely in the same world as the previous few masks, this kind of vertebrae, stingray, skeleton jumble of references. But that was also interesting to me because I think it reminded me of the strange, fickle nature of masks in general. Because I'm always building them on my own face, I often feel like I know what their character is. And the second I see them for the first time on Bjork, or in this case on Tilda Swinton, they totally change into a different character, and it's like I'm seeing them for the first time. So that was really interesting for this. I packaged them up and sent them off to Venice and thought I knew what kind of character they were. And then when I saw the photos emerging, it was really fun because it was this unexpected creature that I didn't even recognize myself. So I have made a couple of new masks in the last few weeks, and they've already been worn and photographed for some exciting projects, which haven't been released yet, so I can't show them or talk about them here, but I'm very happy with them, and I have no idea what I'm making next, which is exciting. I think possibly I'm going to go back to some embroidery, but I'm going to spend the winter here in Iceland working on some new things. Thank you for watching, if you made it all the way through. I could have spoken about each mask for about an hour, so it felt very rushed to go through all of them so quickly, but I hope you found parts of it interesting. Thanks.